I have my favorite bankers in the room, which is noted. We are here on Monday, February 21st, on a very busy day. Glad to see you all here on your holiday to do the people's work for the state of Wyoming. With that, we are going to start with the most exciting bill of the session, Senate File 53, Local Government Liability Pool Amendments. I know, brace yourselves for a busy Monday morning. Looking at this bill, it looks like the sponsor of this bill is myself. And so we'll go ahead and get started right here. Present this bill for what this bill does. Committee members, roll call.
Senator Cooper.
Here.
Senator French.
Here.
Senator Kolb.
Present.
Senator Cost.
Excused.
Chairman Nethercott.
Here. All right, thank you. So we'll go ahead and start with Senate File 53, Local Government Liability Pool Amendments. In a budget session, this bill has already been introduced to the Senate. And so the Senate Judiciary Committee has heard this bill before, but for purposes of explaining this bill, what it does, and to hear some testimony and public comment, I'll briefly walk through the bill. Good senators, members of the public, the local government liability pool is exactly how it sounds, is an ability for local government to pool their resources for liability coverage, works just like insurance. We certainly have that in our state statutes. And so this bill provides some necessary amendments. A couple of things to address right now for what the bill does not do, because I think that's fundamentally more important than what the bill actually does. So the bill does not raise damage caps associated with governmental immunity or the Governmental Claims Act. And so no damage caps are being addressed in this bill, nor is coverage being reduced or expanded. So really, that's why I kind of jest that the bill doesn't do anything particularly that exciting, but provide necessary clarification to how the program works and how its application is applied. So primarily what we know that the bill needs necessary clarification. If we go to page 2, where you can see the additions to the particular statutory language, necessary clarification adding for any claim brought under the Wyoming Governmental Claims Act, the amount specified in paragraphs 1 and 2 of this subsection, and participating local government shall be responsible for the amount of any adjudicated claims and expenses in excess of $1 million. And so generally speaking, good senators and members of the public, and we have an expert here to come talk to us, there are damage caps associated with what the coverage will provide, and that is based on our statutory caps of $250,000 or $500,000 based on the Governmental Claims Act for regular or ordinary negligence of a government entity, and then $1 million, as we previously discussed in the Senate, as it relates to medical professional malpractice coverage of that $1 million piece. So it just provides that necessary clarification in the law. Good senators, do you have any questions for me before we hear from the subject matter experts on this? Seeing none, we will go to Mr. Racines. Welcome, Mr. Racines. Good morning, gentlemen. If you would introduce yourselves to the committee on this fine Monday morning, maybe share with us why there might be a need for this bill.
Good morning. My name is Tori Racines. I'm general counsel for LGLP, the Wyoming Local Government Liability Pool. With me is Director Mike Todd and Kelly Kraka, who's a member of the LGLP board. Would you like me just to jump into why it's necessary? Members, this bill, Chairwoman Nethercott said, is really just a fix-it bill. It fills 2 gaps. Currently, our enabling statute allows the Local Government Liability Board to cover the liability of its members. And by the way, we have 529 members, local government members throughout Wyoming, everything from counties, towns, cities, to special districts, fire boards, library boards, you name it. The enabling statute has a section which we would like the amendment to be 202E, It currently says that we can only pay out $500,000 per occurrence, which is great and fine in almost every situation except two. Under the Governmental Claims Act, $500,000 per occurrence is the usual cap. There's one exception under the Governmental Claims Act, and that's for subsection or section 110B, and that's liability for healthcare provider negligence. That cap is $1 million. Currently, as 202E reads, that means we have potentially $500,000 of liability, which our members already face, which we are unable, according to this section, to cover. The second instance is for claims under federal law for which there is no cap. Therefore, our members already face this liability, and we would, by adding the language on page 2, lines 15 and 16, and again on line 3, page 6 and 7, where this section applies only to the Wyoming Governmental Claims Act claims, you're allowing us clear authority to cover that liability above $500,000. And I should note there is on page 2, line 10, that's basically a typo. That's a leftover from when this statute was enacted and you repealed the old LGSIP statute, which preceded us. That's just a leftover.
Thank you, Mr. Racinas. Questions? Interesting stuff. Thank you, Mr. Racinas. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves to the committee and share with us your thoughts.
Chairman, committee member Kelly Craig-O'Mara-Val. I'm an LGLP board member. I think Tori pretty much covered it. I just like to add, and again, we have 91 of the 99 municipalities, 19 of the 23 counties. We have over 520 entities, and just on behalf of those entities, clearing this up would be a huge thing to these entities. So thank you, and entertain any questions if you have any.
Chairwoman Nethercott, we just appreciate your support for this. I think it just clarifies and solidifies our coverage for our membership.
Questions? Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Would you, I guess, would be your opinion that this should have been written like this in the beginning when it should have been handled, I guess, years ago, but it kind of was found out to be an oversight, or I don't know, something needs clarification or something, or did something happen that required this clarification?
Mr. Racinas.
Chairman Nethercott, Senator Kolb, interesting question. With regard to the healthcare practice liability, something did happen. 1979, the Governmental Claims Act was enacted. It had a $500,000 cap for everything. And then I think it was the original LGSIP Act was enacted in 1986. 1989, the Governmental Claims Act with regard to healthcare provider cap was amended to that 1 million. So I think that when our bill was kind of reimagined, because LGSIP was under the state, it was a self-insurance, but operated under the state. In 1996 or 97, I think it was, it went to the local governments under a joint powers board. So there is a historical explanation for the healthcare provider gap. With regard to the health, federal claims, less of an explanation, I think, but that had to do with the evolution of time.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both, all of you. Further public comment? Nope. All right. Public comment is closed. Committee, back to you.
Move the bill.
Moved by Cold, seconded by Cooper. Discussion on the bill? Seeing none. Roll call vote.
Senator Cooper,
Aye.
Senator French.
Aye.
Senator Cole,
Aye.
Senator Cost, leave it open. Chairwoman Nethercott.
Aye.
Madam Chair, SR 53 passes with 4, possibly 5 ayes.
Thank you. All right, with that, we will move to Senate File 99, Public Monies, Deposits, and Credit Unions. See some similar sponsors of this bill. With that, good senators, I will briefly explain this bill again. Once again, this bill received an introductory vote, and so was already explained to the Senate. But for purposes of public comment here today and the committee's work on the bill, we'll briefly provide some overview. But I do know for purposes of time, we have considerable public comment in the room, so I'll keep these comments brief as I believe the committee understands the concept of the bill. And one, under statute, public monies are restricted from being placed in credit unions essentially, or it's not expressly prohibited, but it's not expressly allowed. And so this bill is intended to provide that express authorization to allow for Wyoming state governments and political subdivisions to pursuant to the same protections and parameters and safeguards to place those funds in credit unions and banks, whatever is their choice and whatever serves their communities best. As the committee may recall, really the genesis of the bill comes from a pragmatic concern from our smaller rural communities. And we heard extensive testimony out of the town of Shoshone in Fremont County, where they don't have a bank, but there is a credit union across the street from their town hall. And they receive significant funds for their operations of their town government, sometimes in excess of $20,000 per day. And there's nowhere to safely place those funds because they cannot take them to the credit union. And so they end up putting them in their safe. And then they end up also then transporting those through a town employee. And oftentimes they're one police officer back and forth between the town of Riverton and Shoshone. And so it becomes kind of a dangerous situation. It becomes a situation that they don't feel comfortable with and one that they would prefer to place those deposits every day into the credit union, which is located conveniently across the street. And so there is no kind of practical reason why one would not think a public entity should not be able to place those funds in a financial institution like the credit unions. And so this bill is intending to kind of level that playing field in that way. I believe that you'll hear some testimony that the current laws associated with banks versus credit unions already gives the credit unions an upper hand. And that certainly is likely true. Unfortunately, this bill in the state of Wyoming's public funds are not intended to solve that, and this bill can't solve that. And so that's a different issue. That's really more at the federal level that I look forward to seeing these brilliant bankers in the room address with their Congress folks. But we'll get there sometime in the future. So with that, good senators, any questions? All right, seeing none, let's go to public comment. Mr. Pickard, please come forward. Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Chairman. My name is Dave Pickard. Members of the committee, I represent the Mountain West Credit Union Association. With me today is Dan Diorio from the Mountain West Credit Union Association as well, and he'll be able to answer any additional specific questions. But before you today is Senate File 99, Public Monies, Deposits, and Credit Unions. The bill is simple. It simply adds the words "or credit union" and the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund to existing statutes. Madam Chairman, as you indicated, the need for the bill, this is a long age-old discussion between banks and credit unions. There is a constitutional issue that I believe we will address as well. But in its simplest form, what we're allowing is for public monies to be deposited in credit unions if they so choose. And ultimately, as you read in the statutes, it's authorizing the Board of Deposits to authorize deposits in credit unions. So it's not going to be a run on the banks by credit unions. Credit unions are will have to proactively apply to the Board of Deposits and get authorization. With that comes all of the safeguards that exist for the current banks that are authorized as deposits. A couple of things the opponents are going to tell you is that this isn't a simple bill. And one of the reasons is because of taxes. You're going to hear that credit unions are tax exempt. That is a federal law that went along with the creation of credit unions under the Federal Credit Union Act in 1934. It is a ongoing discussion every session of Congress at the federal level. And since 1934, the Congress has chosen to continue that tax exemption. But what I will say when it comes to community banks and credit unions in the state of Wyoming, most community banks in the state are organized under Subchapter S of the Internal Revenue Service Code. And as such, they act with their profits just as credit unions do. They pass those down to their shareholders that ultimately then put them on their individual 1040s. So that is one thing that you will hear and you heard last year. Looking at the difference between the Constitution, where it talks about banks. When our framers of the Constitution sat in this town in September of 1889, they contemplated for many, many days what the words meant. And Madam Chairman, you know this very well, being an attorney, that the Supreme Court does look at the aspects of those contemplations. And back in 1889, there was no difference between banks and credit unions because credit unions didn't exist. And in fact, if you take a look at Webster's dictionary back in that day, the term bank was the table, counter, or place of business of a money changer. Now the building or office used for banking purposes. It went on further to say an establishment for the custody, loan, exchange, or issue of money, and for the facilitating to transmit money or drafts or bills of exchange. An institution incorporated performing one of many or more of those such functions. And in today's Webster, a bank is defined as an establishment for the custody, loan, exchange, or issue of money for the extension of credit and for facilitating the transmission of funds. Clearly, if you think about the strict interpretation of the Constitution, banks, the definition is very clear back when they contemplated that. But it's in this day and age, we have to look at it from the reasonable perspective. And your colleagues in 1977 also contemplated this discussion when they inserted the term savings and loan associations into our statutes, authorizing them to accept public monies. And in fact, that bill back Senate File 192 back in 1977 passed the House 60-0 and passed the Senate 23 with 7 members being absent. It was towards the end of the session. And they operated a little bit differently back then. But what you will see is adding the words credit unions is just the same as adding the word savings and loan associations back in 1977. This will provide for our political subdivisions to have options. Certainly the issue of the small communities in a couple of locations in Wyoming where there are credit unions and not banks, it will certainly help them. But beyond that, it really is about a choice for all of our political subdivisions to look at where they're going to place their funds and the relationships that they have with their locals. Madam Chairman, a couple other things that you might hear is about Community Reinvestment Act. The Community Reinvestment Act is a federal law requiring community banks to reinvest their funds. I would argue that was that the nature of that act is to compel them to do so. Credit unions by nature do all of their community reinvestments in their communities. You can see that, I think last year's testimony talked about, maybe not here in the Senate, but it was in the House, about whose names are on the back of the jerseys of our Little League teams and who supports the FFA. Credit unions and banks are very similar in that nature. They all are invested in their communities. Another comment was made in previous testimony about the PPP loans. That was the Federal CARES Act money that came down, and I worked directly with the Bankers Association and their president in working through that special session, authorizing those PPPs and being a part of that. Again, another part of community reinvestment. With that, Madam Chairman, I'll stand for any questions specifically on the bill, and if Dan needs to add anything, he will.
Good morning. Questions from Senator Cooper? All right, any other questions right now? Please introduce yourself and provide your comments.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My name is Daniel DiOrio. I'm the Director of Policy for the Mountain West Credit Union Association. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I just wanted to add a few numbers to Mr. Pickard's excellent remarks this morning, just to give you a good sense of how credit unions are operating here in the state. Despite being authorized for nearly 100 years, credit unions are 15% of the market share here in Wyoming. Banks control 85% of the assets here, 85% of the market share. We commissioned an economic study to determine whether or not or how credit unions might affect the deposits in the state if they were able to take public deposits. We found that it would change the amount of deposits that banks had by less than 2%. So building off Mr. Pickard's remarks, this would not be a run on community banks. We know there are longstanding relationships there, but there are many instances where the political subdivisions in the state need to have the choice and need to have the ability to use an alternative institution like a credit union for safety and soundness issues. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions from the committee? Just a quick question, whoever can answer it. The 1977 legislature created the Savings and Loans Association. What exactly is that? I don't think any of us are familiar with that or see that in our daily operations of banking.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, it's a great question for the debate here in 2022. Savings and loan associations, as I recall, came to be in the late 1950s and 1960s and early 70s, and they were much more ubiquitous across the state of Wyoming leading into the 1977 legislative session. But they were, under the definition of Webster, they were just like a bank. They accepted deposits, they loaned money. They had some specific purposes, as I recall, and maybe my friends from the banks will expand on that. But they were very much in all the communities. It was about community reinvestment of the public dollars that our subdivisions have. And they were working, probably in some instances, there were savings and loan associations in communities where there weren't traditional banks at the time. So fast forward a few years, I think 1989, for those that recall, there's a large default among S&Ls. FSLIC was their state federal savings and loan insurance corporation, just as FDIC is for the banks and NCUSIF is for the credit unions. Ultimately, the federal government created the Resolution Trust Corporation, RTC, that basically took in all the assets of all those S&Ls that weren't then purchased by banks and liquidated all of that. It was an interesting, if not scary time in the financial institution industry in the United States. And we no longer have S&Ls throughout the United States. It's kind of a short-lived phenomenon, maybe 30, 40 years at best.
So Mr. Pickard, is our statutes need updating in that regard for the removal of those, or did I just open up a hornet's nest right there?
Madam Chairman, that's a great question. I think if you really want to clean up the statutes and bring them up to 2022, then removing savings and loan associations, I don't know what additional implications they would have. Certainly not in that industry if it even exists today. But what I will say is that there's many other instances in state statutes, in the banking division code itself. It references state credit unions, which do not exist in the state of Wyoming. Credit unions do. They're all federally chartered. We've never had a state credit union act. Many other states do have both the federal chartered institutions and state chartered institutions, just like Wyoming has federally chartered banks and state chartered banks. And the history of the discussion of public funds in these types of institutions is long and varied. There was a recognition several years ago, and the legislature corrected some issues with the difference between interstate banks and national banks and state chartered banks for exactly this purpose of public monies on deposit. So there certainly could be additional revisions and cleanup in statute. But what's before you today is just the addition of federally chartered credit unions and NCUSIF in the statutes authorizing the Board of Deposits to authorize institutions for public monies. I will also point out there are other statutes on the books that credit unions do fall under that are regulated. And just 2 years ago, maybe it was last year, the UCCC was recodified. And it does have regulatory oversight with federal credit unions. And in fact, you have another bill before you, Senate File 76, not in front of this committee, I don't believe, but was introduced last week that deals with financial exploitation. And credit unions in the state of Wyoming will be regulated under that act as well.
Thank you. Any questions? Yeah, Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I can't resist when you talk about savings and loans. I had my first account in the savings and loan. And I didn't quite know the history of why it went away, but now I'm informed. And some of my younger colleagues in the Senate, I guess, didn't remember that. So I did appreciate the information on what had happened to the savings and loans. And, so you, on this particular issue, do you find any negative impacts to the banks over their present situation currently?
Madam Chairman, Senator Kolb, I do not see any. And as Mr. Zodorio testified to, this is not going to be a wholesale shift in public monies to banks or from banks to credit unions. Much like any new entrant into the marketplace, whether it be insurance or financial institutions, they're going to have to go out there and make the case. Again, first they have to apply to the Board of Deposits to be authorized. And then ultimately it's going to come down to, what the choice of that municipality or political subdivision is. And they're going to make their choices based on relationships, based on rate of returns, I would imagine, based on a whole host of things. But all this bill does is give them additional choice and their ability to manage their funds and deposit them and have those relationships as they see fit.
Any follow-up? Gentlemen, would you like to recall the days of the savings and loan associations? No? All right. All right. All right. Thank you both for being here. All right. Further public comment? No further public comment?
Madam Chair, we do have one hand raised in the waiting room.
Let's go to that now.
Okay.
And then stay close, stay up here. Come on forward. Have a seat. Yep.
We have Lisa Spillman.
Welcome, Ms. Spelman. Good to see you this morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chairman and committee members. I'm Lisa Jury Spillman. I'm General Counsel for the Wyoming State Treasurer. As you know, the State Treasurer sits as Secretary of the Board of Deposits, and under the statute, he provides recommendations to the Board of Deposits for approval of state depositories. And this bill adds credit unions to the list of institutions he can approve. And we don't have any objections at all. The bill looks fine.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Spillman. Appreciate hearing from you. Questions for the State Treasurer's Office? Do you recall savings and loan associations, Ms. Spillman? Any comments? Just
I do.
kidding. The memories. All right. Thank you, Ms. Spillman. Appreciate you being here today. All right. With that, looks like we have the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. Welcome, gentlemen. If you'd introduce yourselves to the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. With me is our Legislative Committee Chair, who you've heard from earlier, Mayor Kelly Krakow of Albin. We'll be brief because we know you have a lot of business. And in fact, a similar bill was heard last year, and you heard extensively from us then. And I believe the committee was of the same makeup then, so I won't repeat all that, especially given the great synopsis the chair gave you earlier in the meeting on that. But suffice it to say that this, will be potentially helpful to, many of our members, but significantly helpful to a few of our members, like Shoshone, who the chairman reminded you about. And I don't need to go into that because I'm sure you all recall, but I would certainly just want to thank you for your consideration of this bill and encourage you to send it to the body for consideration on the floor. I would, after any comments that Mayor Krakow might like to make, I would stand for any questions.
Mayor, welcome.
Chairman, committee members, I'll just add a little bit to that. Town of Albin doesn't have a bank or a credit union, but we have to drive 18 miles one way to the closest bank. So in support of the ones that do have a credit union there that can cut down on that mileage and safety in the wintertime, we'd appreciate an aye vote. And thank you, and take any questions if you have any.
Questions for the mayor? Good senators, do you know where Albin is? Sure you do. Mayor, why don't you give us a quick speech on Albin?
Well, we're about, chairwoman and committee member, we're about halfway between here and Torrington. We're about 18 miles north of Pine Bluffs, if you know where that is, 2 miles from Nebraska state line,
In Laramie County.
Laramie County.
Population of?
Well, it was 182, but the last census said 169, which we're debating that.
Seems to be a theme across the state this last census. Mayor, thank you for being here. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
All
Madam
right.
Chair,
Yes.
I might also add that there's no savings and loans in Albin. Thank you.
Business opportunities present. All right. All right. Further public comment? There's about 40 bankers in the room. They're quite quiet. Mr. Meyer, good morning.
Morning, Madam Chairwoman Nethercott and members of the committee, Scott Meyer with the Wyoming Bankers Association. I think that it's interesting to hear some of the comments that were made, so maybe I can help clarify a few things. Yes, the credit unions did not come along until much later in the 1950s and what have you, but understand this. Credit unions are regulated, insured like every other institution, but at the beginning, the way this was formed was that they had to have a common bond of occupation or association. That common bond was usually with the employees of a particular industry or a particular area or some kind of a well-defined neighborhood or community or rural district. In 1998, the United States Supreme Court affirmed that and said you cannot have many multiple common bonds within the same credit union. And shortly thereafter, then Congress passed and President Clinton signed into law a new law that said, oh, no, you can't. So now all of a sudden you see credit unions that can cover anything from were you born in the United States? So they don't really have the common bond that was once was the intention of credit unions. They are mutual associations. They are co-ops. And we'll get into this in a minute, but that's an important distinction. I know that the comments were made about savings and loans. You can still charter savings and loan in the state of Wyoming. Savings and loans still exist. There's one up in Bighorn County, and I'm sure Senator Koss knows exactly the federal savings institution that is up there. So those are things that are still in existence today. But being a co-op and being mutually owned is not the only thing that brings up the idea of whether they're taxed or not. And I think that was brought up earlier, because there are a lot of mutual associations that are taxed. But for the benefits of credit unions, they are not taxed. And why? Because the idea was at some point in time that they would provide their members, their owners, with more dividends, higher returns on their investments, and lower interest rates on their loans. And that's why the common bond was so critical. Now you look at it, you say that's not really the case anymore. But credit unions have avoided paying federal taxes and avoided paying a lot of state taxes on that. And I will tell you right now, that's something that you need to think about. Why has this really become an issue all of a sudden? Why has this become our annual soiree into this area? Is it really the towns, small towns like the Wranglers community or the Wolverines community, really? We're not talking, I will challenge any comment that says that it's because of $20,000 sometimes a day. Remember, these are cash deposits. Everything else has remote collection devices. You can pick up, you can scan checks, you can do it on your phone, you can run it through a machine, and majority of these deposits are in checks. If they're cash, I don't think that there's $20,000 in there. And if there is, then maybe the legislature ought to look at refinance or figure out how they're going to take away some of the funding to the municipalities, because those cities have got it down pat. I mean, that just seems like an awful lot.
Mr. Meyer, you want the legislature to take away funding from cities and towns?
If they can generate $20,000 a day, there you go.
Evidently, you've not driven through the fast lane in Shoshone. It's a little
Let's
speed
talk
trap.
about why this argument kind of fails, on why these credit unions are really not what you think they are. Okay? We did talk about taxes. And yes, I think Mr. Pickard brought up the fact that these are S corps. Well, S corps people pay their taxes too, on top of their own individual taxes. They just pay them out of their own pockets. So that really isn't a fair comparison. But consider this for a minute. We're talking about some federal taxes and why this is important. Consider that banks in 2020 paid over $27 million in federal taxes. Federal credit unions paid zero. Did you know that in Wyoming in 2020, that it's estimated that credit unions used their tax exempt status to pay that could have been paid almost $2.6 million in taxes? Did you know the state's largest credit union, whose world headquarters are right here in Cheyenne, would have paid close to $1.5 million in taxes? Did you know that in 2020, that one of the largest credit unions located in the southwestern part of the state avoided paying over $700,000 in taxes? You look at this from the state standpoint, you say, yeah, but we don't charge the state income tax. That's all at the federal level. But guess what? I bet almost everybody in this room is paying federal taxes. So why is not the credit unions? Nurses combined in Wyoming paid over $66 million in taxes. Cashiers in Wyoming paid over almost $17 million in taxes. And our Wyoming teachers paid almost $25 million in taxes. And credit unions, zero. And it's not just those federal taxes. It's the sales tax. Think about what you're doing with your communities and those sales taxes. Federal credit unions are exempt from paying sales taxes. They'll pay their property taxes, they pay their payroll taxes, but they are exempt from sales tax. Think about that, what that does to your communities. In conversations that I've had with various members of city councils around the state, they are not only shocked, but appalled of the fact that the credit unions, the big credit unions that they have in their communities are not paying any sales tax. Think about the world headquarters of one of our largest credit unions right here in Cheyenne. Everything that goes into that building, furniture, supplies, equipment, whether it's copiers and toners, whether it's paper, nothing is paid in sales tax. None of that goes to our communities, none of it. And so then the idea comes up and you say, geez, we want to take taxpayer funds and put them in a non-tax paying entity. That sounds pretty powerful to me. And what does the state get in return for this? May they get a little markup on interest? May they get a little bit higher interest on their municipal deposits than maybe a bank will pay? Short-term gains do not offset long-term losses to the state or any of these municipalities. Credit unions argue that they can do this, but it's clear that because of their tax-free status, that they don't pay taxes on this income, then the income that the credit union is paying is not being taxed at all. And again, you're using taxpayer funds, and the state is not getting any benefit over this. And what about capital? Let's talk about capital a little bit. The capital of the state's largest credit union is over $1.6 billion. That's larger than any bank in Wyoming that's headquartered here, by a large amount. And banks, however, are still being forced to compete on the same playing field with the people that have all this capital and yet no obligation to pay those. And then think about who are the customers of those credit unions. Is it going to be the municipalities? Who are they targeting? Remember when I first sat down here and I talked to you a little bit about the common bond? They still have that. They can still do it. They just now expanded it. But they can't do a common bond with everybody. And so they get to pick and choose who they want to have their common bonds. Banks are required. Under the Fair Lending Act, banks are required to bank everybody. They don't get a right to discriminate against anybody. Credit unions will say they don't discriminate either, but they get to choose who they are. And very small portion. Yes, originally they were talked about for the low and modest income things, but a very small portion of their membership is these small income people, these low income people, the low income neighborhoods. It's not there. Then I heard also the conversation about the Community Reinvestment Act. And yes, Mr. Pickard's right, there was some discussion, but the banks are required. That came about back in the 1950s and stuff when they were having problems with places like Chicago and Detroit and having low funded neighborhoods and people weren't banking. So the Congress came in and said, you have to do this. Funny, credit unions were listed in there too until the very last part of it. And then some lobbyists convinced them otherwise, I guess. And so they took credit unions out. But the reality is they don't have to target that because they don't have to target those to be members. And by the way, having your name on the back of the jersey does not qualify for community reinvestment. It has to be for low income and moderate income neighborhoods and people. That's where your banks are doing this. And then I want to just quickly point out that the other benefits that we've talked about on there is the reinvestment of whatever they have to do in this community is because of their community. When you invest in a credit union and they're not paying those taxes, that money isn't doing anything for the state. That's not helping everything. The money that's invested with banks stays in Wyoming. It is in Wyoming. That's what it's for. We've already heard a little bit about the PPP, and I won't go over that, but I will tell you that with public deposits, there are requirements that bank can have $1,000 a day in a deposit for a municipality. And then on 364 days of the year, and then on the 365 days, they put in $1 million. Guess how much the banks have to have to back up that and for security on that? $1 million. Right now, I can't find anything that would say that will change under credit unions, that they're still covered under the NCUA for $250,000. You could try to make some changes in that. But the biggest thing that I want to point out to you, and I think it was starting to touch on this a little bit, and I was really glad to hear from the state treasurer's office, but I want to talk to you a little about who owns them. Banks have shareholders. We all know that. They might get charged. They may be taxed as S corps or C corps or whatever, but they still have shareholders. And the same thing with your savings and loans. But credit unions don't. They have members. Everybody who puts money is a member. First of all, I don't think it's a really good idea for government to own financial institutions and be a player in that when they are an owner in it. But more importantly, I would ask you to look at and consider Article 16, Section 6 of our Constitution that says neither the state nor any county, city, township, town, school district, or any other public political subdivision shall subscribe to or become the owner of capital stock of any association or corporation. You look at that and you say, yeah, that's banks. And are we part of that? Well, under the Uniform Unincorporated Nonprofit Association Act that Wyoming has adopted, a person that is subject to that includes government and governmental agencies. I think this is a much bigger issue than whether this absurdly written law is only kicking out credit unions from little small communities and making them have a choice. This is a big decision. This has a lot of repercussions. And you look at it and you say, what are we doing and why are we doing it? Because we can't seem to get the cash deposits down the street, I guess. I don't know. Certainly stand for any questions, but I will tell you that the Wyoming Bankers Association does not support this bill. And we don't think you should either.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. So I'm just going to sum up your testimony is you would like the credit unions taxed by the state of Wyoming.
Pardon me?
You would like the credit unions taxed by the state of Wyoming.
Well, that would be wonderful if they paid the same taxes, the same rates that everybody else paid.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Any questions for Mr. Meyer? Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Meyer, do you see anything in this bill that precludes a municipality from dealing with a bank rather than a credit union? Isn't it, when you say it's a municipality's choice to use a bank or a credit union, according to this bill, there's nothing here that precludes the municipality from using a bank? Your argument is very compelling for using a bank, but is there anything here that precludes them from using a bank?
Mr. Meyer.
Madam Chairwoman, Senator Cooper, no, there's nothing that would preclude you from, that says you have to or preclude you from using a bank or a savings loan or a savings association.
All right. Any further questions? All right. Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Further public comment? Seeing none. Public comment, Mr. Bass. Raise your hand if you intend to provide public comment on this bill or if you're thinking about it, recognizing there's some hesitation in the room. Raise your hand. If you don't raise your hand now, you won't be able to provide public comment on this bill. You're the last public comment, Mr. Bass. So good to see you this morning.
Madam Chair, nice to see you also. Members of the committee, great to see you also. My name is Tom Bass. I'm president of Wyoming Bank and Trust right here in Cheyenne. I've been a banker for 43 years, and I do remember the S&L days very well. Seen many changes in 43 years. One of the major changes is the power that credit unions have gained over the last several years. Scott Meyer talked about many advantages that they have. I welcome competition, but let's level the playing field. They're not, they've got their tax exemptions. I've got a graph. This is in Laramie County of the credit unions and their deposits. This is over about 20 years, and they have really expanded. So they are really doing well. There is a credit union in the state that has total assets of $1.6 billion. That is bigger than any bank in the state of Wyoming. So I think the credit unions are doing very well. I think there is also a sheet from the NCUA, which is an association for the credit unions. They break it out by state. And here's a chart right here. They are ranked, Wyoming credit unions are ranked 2 and 3 in several categories of the strongest credit unions in the country. So with that, I do not agree with this bill. I'm against it. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Questions? Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, thank you for that information. A couple pieces of clarifying information. Is there a bank that has a presence in the state of Wyoming with total assets over $1.2 billion? This would probably be a national bank, right? I know the state of Wyoming deposits with Bank of the West, lots of controversy. Governor Gordon, I remember during his campaign, whether or not the state of Wyoming should pull its deposits with Bank of the West, whose shareholders are international and global and don't support the energy industry in Wyoming. So there are banks doing business in Wyoming and depositing public funds with assets over $1.2 billion, certainly.
Madam Chair, that is correct. And they're the larger national banks.
And so the credit union you refer to, and I'm just speculating here, is a credit union that's not just located in the state of Wyoming, but is a regional credit union, correct?
Correct.
And so is it more appropriate to compare that credit union as a national credit union to the other banks in the state that are considered national credit unions?
I would say that's a small regional credit union, as opposed to like a Wells Fargo, larger bank like that.
And so really the concern is for the state chartered banks. Is that fair?
Correct.
How do you feel about the state chartered banks' ability to compete with the national banks in the state of Wyoming?
Madam Chair, I think the small community banks like ours, we're able to act quickly. We have deposit relationship with many people, professionals. We can act quickly on loan decisions. So I think we can compete with national banks very well.
And do you have any data by chance on the amount of state chartered banks that hold public deposits?
I do not have that information, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bass. Any final questions for Mr. Bass? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right, public comment is closed. Does anybody have their hand raised at the time I called? Public comment is closed. There's no one on Zoom. Committee, back to you. Moved by Senator Kolb, seconded by Senator Cooper. Discussion on the bill. Seeing none, roll call.
Senator Cooper. Senator French.
Excused.
Senator Cole.
Aye.
Senator Cost.
Aye.
Chairwoman Nethercott.
Aye.
Madam Chair, Senate File 99 passes with 4 ayes and 1 excuse.
All right, thank you. Committee will go on to Senate File 102, the Second Amendment Protection Act. I see Senator Hicks is here with us this morning. Senator Hicks, welcome to the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of the committee, and for the opportunity to present to you today the Senate File 102, the Second Amendment Protection Act. Members of the committee, we all know that Wyoming is one of the most pro-Second Amendment states in the United States. We also have the highest percentage of gun ownership of any state in the United States. Consequently, Madam Chairman and members of the committee, it is inherently important for us as the legislative branch of government to protect our citizens and their Second Amendment rights, and also protect our law enforcement agencies. Madam Chairman, from unconstitutional federal acts that would infringe upon either our citizens' Second Amendment rights to own or keep, or law enforcement's ability to protect the citizens of the state of Wyoming from what we would perceive as unconstitutional acts by the federal government. So, Madam Chairman and members of the committee, what I bring to you today is a culmination of months of a collaborative effort between members of the legislature, pro-Second Amendment groups like Gun Owners of America, and law enforcement agencies across the state of Wyoming. So, Madam Chairman, if you would allow me, I'd like to just walk you through the bill and just provide you an oversight of what the bill does. Madam Chairman, if we just go to page 2, really, we start out into the bill, and the Declaration of Authority gets into our Second Amendment rights, and then we declare the authority of the state of Wyoming to promulgate this new statutory provision under the Second Amendment and also the 10th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. And Madam Chairman, we also bring in the concept, if you'll get down on line 14, of Prince versus the United States. Members of the committee, this was a Supreme Court ruling that came out in 1997, and it deals with a firearms regulation provision passed by Congress as part of the Brady Act. The Brady Act was restricted firearms within by the federal government. The Supreme Court struck that provision down in Prince versus the United States. And when they struck that provision down, basically, if I will just provide a brief summary, is that the federal government can pass laws, but the states under our dual sovereignty system of government are not obligated to implement federal laws. Now, the federal government can come in here and do that, but we are not obligated to enforce those laws. And Madam Chairman and members of the committee, that's really important when we get into the context of the bill about having our local law enforcement put in a position, a very untenable position, of potentially having to go enforce a federal law on the citizens of the state of Wyoming that we think is untenable from a standpoint that it infringes upon their ownership and possession of guns and firearms. So, Madam Chairman, we'll bring that provision into the bill. So if we go to the bill, it's relatively straightforward. It starts down on the bottom of page 2, just prohibiting the enforcement of federal regulation of firearms. Goes over under subsection A, and it says the state and all political subdivisions of the state are prohibited from using any personnel or funding appropriated by the legislature or any local sources of funding for the administration or cooperation with any act, law, treaty, executive order, or regulation of the United States government that infringes or impedes upon their constitutional rights under the Second Amendment. It goes on, Madam Chairman and members of the committee, to further call out and protect our law enforcement community that says nothing in this act shall limit or restrict a public servant from providing assistance to the federal government to enforce federal rules or regulations as long as they are not subject to subsection A of the bill, which is the provision in there that says, if we feel these are unconstitutional acts that infringe upon their second rights, we're just not going to enforce them in Wyoming. Does not preclude the federal government from coming in here, but our local law enforcement would not have to enforce those under the provisions of this bill. Madam Chairman, it also goes down in subsection B and brings in a penalty component, and just says that any individual that violated this provision of state statutes would be subject to a misdemeanor. And we call out in section 6 or 68405. And that's important, members of the committee, because that is the Wyoming Firearms Freedom Act. That law has been on the books since 2010. I won't go into that. There is some confusion by some members of the citizenship of the state of Wyoming that somehow this bill only deals with Wyoming firearms. It does not. It deals with federal actions. It just says the penalty, which the penalty in the Wyoming Firearms Freedom Act is for federal employees that come in here under the Commerce Clause. If a firearm is manufactured in the state of Wyoming solely for use in the state of Wyoming, it does not leave the state boundaries. It is basically that if they come in here and try to enforce that, there would be a penalty associated for federal employees. So we're just calling out the same level of penalty for a state employee as would be for a federal employee under the Wyoming Firearms Freedom Act. Consistent provision in statutes, Madam Chairman. Members of the committee, that's the bill. And I would stand for any questions, Madam Chairman, when it is at the committee's discretion, if they choose to move this bill forward and work it. I do have a couple of proposed amendments I would like to suggest for the committee at that time. But Madam Chairman, I would yield to the committee and I see if there's any questions.
Any questions from the committee right now? Seeing none, Senator Hicks, if you would go ahead and just share with us your amendments now so we can hear them and think about them. And then
Okay.
also would afford the public to provide comment on those proposed amendments too. So we all have a sense of what options are on the table.
Okay, Madam Chairman. So if we want to go to page 3, line 6, at the end of the sentence where it says cooperate with any, after any, I would like to insert the unconstitutional. So any unconstitutional act, law, treaty, et cetera, et cetera. Madam Chairman, it's been brought to my attention by legal staff, if we go down to line 7, and we bring in the concept of a judicial order, I would like to strike judicial or. Members of the committee, the rationale is that potentially could lead to a separation of powers issue. And we want to get a clean bill out of here that would stand any litmus test or scrutiny by the courts. And so I would like to strike that provision, Madam Chairman. And then if we go down on page 3, line 17, after section, would propose to insert this language. Nothing in this act shall be construed to prohibit Wyoming agencies or political subdivisions from accepting aid from the federal government for the purposes of enforcing Wyoming laws. So again, Madam Chairman, the rationale behind that is certainly we would not want to prohibit our state and local law enforcement to being able to accept federal aid in the pursuit of criminals or felons under that language, that they could accept federal dollars and in fact to work on task force with the federal government, use federal funding to do that for law enforcement activities within the state of Wyoming. Madam Chairman, what we're trying to do is make sure that the bad guys are penalized and the good guys have the tools to go after the bad guys here. That's the only thing we're trying to make sure and make that clear. So Madam Chairman, if we would go down to on line 20, page 3, after who, would like to insert the word knowingly. So it will now read, who knowingly violates subsection A. Members of the committee, I think this is very important because what we wouldn't want to do is penalize a public service or particularly local law enforcement who inadvertently actually violated the laws of the state of Wyoming. So if you can envision some young person coming out of law enforcement academy and just making a dumb mistake, certainly this would provide that opportunity that there would be a demonstration that they had to know that they were actually working with the federal government in the confiscation or the administration of a federal law that had adverse effect on our citizens' Second Amendment rights. So we would bring in that concept there, who knowingly violates subsection A. Madam Chairman, the only other thing that I had was on line 21. After the. So we just want to make sure that people understand we would insert misdemeanor. So actually we would want to strike the too. So it would be subject to a misdemeanor penalty, subject to, no. We will leave the, so it'll be subject to the misdemeanor penalties in WS 68405B. So that just calls out that it's a misdemeanor for anybody, so they don't have to sort through green books to see what that penalty is. So, Madam Chairman, that would be the only suggested amendments that I have at this time. Stand for any questions.
Thank you, Senator Hicks. Questions for Senator Hicks on those amendments? Senator Cooper?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Hicks, I want to be clear in my mind on page 3, in section B, this allows any local law enforcement to assist federal authorities with investigations that are outside of section A, but it also allows the feds to assist local authorities with any investigation that are also outside of section A. Is that correct? So they can cooperate back and forth on federal or local, just outside of section A.
Madam Chairman, that is absolutely correct. And with the new language in it would also allow them to accept federal funding to be able to do those same type of investigations and cooperations.
All right. Thank you, Senator. Senator Cole?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Senator Hicks, I guess I just want to clarify the intent, I guess, on page 3, line 20, and then knowingly. I guess I envision that referring to possibly undercover federal authorities working with law enforcement, where the law enforcement might not know they're undercover. Is that maybe some of that, or maybe you could expound on that a little bit more on the reason why we want knowingly in there?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, it's hard to hypothesize and run through all of the circumstances. I give you one, but that very well could be another circumstance where they were actually pursuing some other federal case and has inadvertently run into a situation where there may have been firearms under a federal law that involved. That would again get back to that they had to know previously going in there that that was the nature of the case or the investigation, that they were working with federal government. So I do think that would provide that assurances that under those inadvertent circumstances like that, that they would still not be prosecuted under the law, under this law.
Thank you, Senator Hicks. Any additional questions for Senator Hicks? All right, seeing none. Stay close, Senator Hicks.
All right. Thank you,
All
Madam
right.
Chairman, members of the committee.
All right, further public comment on this bill? Please come forward. I believe you have the capacity to figure it out yourselves. All right, Mr. Cole, welcome.
Senator, Chairwoman, the members of the committee, my name is Nephi Cole. I'm the Director of Government Relations and State Affairs for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. We are the Firearms Trade Association of America. So we are the manufacturers, retailers, and distributors of firearms. Thank you for taking the opportunity to look at this bill. We think it's important. We think it's worthy of your time. There are some significant changes that are going to be likely this year in federal firearms regulations that are likely to make it much more difficult for law enforcement at the state level to determine what is and is not a firearm that would be controlled by the federal government. In particular, it's likely this year that we'll see a change in the definitions of frames and receivers at the federal level. And so currently you have different firearms that are, they call them, have what they might call an upper and a lower, such as an AR-15 style firearm. It requires only serialization of a single part. It's likely that within the next year that there's been a proposal by the current administration to require additional serialization of different parts of the firearms. That's going to make it very difficult to track different firearms and to maintain the legality of different firearms. There may be some provisions in there that will require folks to re-serialize things like the upper receiver barrels, trigger groups, and things like that are associated with firearms. And so this could inadvertently put citizens of your state in contravention of federal law without knowingly wanting to be there. And so we think a law like this makes a lot of sense for you guys to avoid putting your local law enforcement in that position. Additionally, there's a proposed rule that will prohibit the use of or may change some of the definitions surrounding the use of what they call a pistol brace. And so a pistol brace is something you would use on a large handgun. There's some significant subjectivity in that proposed rule from the ATF that would make it where, depending on the type of optic you put on a large pistol, it could move it back and forth from being a controlled class 3 weapon or just being a standard handgun that anybody could purchase. And again, these are objective standards that the ATF is considering, or excuse me, subjective standards the ATF is considering putting on. And I think it could cause some significant challenges for some citizens in the state of Wyoming. So once again, thank you for considering a law that will avoid putting your law enforcement officers in the position of being, if you will, bad cop in that situation.
Mr. Cole, thank you. Mr. Cole, do you have the latest statistics associated with gun sales in the United States?
I don't have them in front of me, but I have quite a few statistics about gun sales. Madam Chairwoman, we sold, I would say over the last 2 years, that I think the most important thing that we can tell you is that we sold at least 14 million firearms to first-time gun buyers, people who had never purchased a firearm before in their lives. 14 million of them became gun owners. It's had a tremendous impact on the amount of demand for our dealers as well as on ammunition.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. All right. Further public comment? Mr. Winnie, welcome.
Madam Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I just wanted to make a note, as you sometimes get into supremacy issues. And some years ago, there was a Supreme Court decision designating the chief law enforcement officer of a locality, whatever a county is, the sheriff or chief of police, and that federal authorities were required to coordinate with and perhaps even be subject to his direction. Subject to your questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Winnie, thank you. Questions for Mr. Winnie? All right, seeing none. Appreciate your time here. Further public comment, gentleman in the corner. Come on up. Let's get a front row seat. We'll get you ready to go. You're next. All right. Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Chairman. My name is Steve Amelia from Cheyenne, Wyoming, and you are my senator. So good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, I send emails to you once in a while. Hopefully you read them.
I do. Yes. I think I represent a good number of folks in the room.
Thank you. I would like to say that I was somewhat disappointed in that Senate File 87 and House Bill 133, which I had read.
Mr. Amelia?
Pardon? Yes.
You will speak on Senate File 102.
Yes, ma'am. So I would, a little prepared comment here. There are many people that consistently look for ways to nullify the Second Amendment, and I'm not necessarily sure why. They say there's too much gun violence on our streets, and they want to control. They don't want to take the guns of the citizens who are opposed, as opposed to the criminals. So, do we need gun control or do we need criminal control? Criminals are such because they don't obey the laws, and they won't obey other gun laws either. So regular citizens will be defenseless from criminals and tyrannical politicians, if we get any in there. We can look at history and learn from it, make things better, or ignore history and be prey to mass genocide, which teaches us that anytime a government implements gun control for our safety, mass slaughter follows. If politicians succeed in gutting our Second Amendment and or confiscating our guns, do you think that we Americans will fare any better than other nations who suffered mass extinction? And I would say, no, we won't. Consider these gun control facts from Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. Excellent website. Between 1911 and 1994, the following countries established gun control for public safety, and the approximate number of citizens who were exterminated by their own governments are: Turkey, 1.5 million were exterminated. Soviet Union, approximately 20 million. China, approximately 45 million were exterminated. Germany, 20 million. Cambodia, 2 million. Guatemala, 200,000. Uganda, 300,000 exterminated. Rwanda, 800,000. This adds up to approximately 89,800,000 people that were exterminated by their own government because gun control was implemented for their own safety. Though all of these estimates of extermination deaths have been debated, the point is when the governments initiate gun control and not criminal control, vast populations are killed by their own government. One could say at that point, politicians then become the criminals. It is essential for us to protect our Second Amendment, our freedoms and our lives, as current and past and future administrations have and will attempt to enact unconstitutional laws eroding our freedoms. Gun control and red flags laws are always in the news. Many politicians are obsessed with gutting the Second Amendment, completely disarming Americans in spite of the Constitution. Beto O'Rourke has mentioned that, heck yes, we will take your AR-15s and your AK-47s because they are weapons of war. Actually, having spent 31 years in the Navy as a gunner's mate, there's really no comparison between the AR-15, et cetera, and consider 50 caliber machine guns, M240 machine guns, 25 millimeter chain guns, 40 millimeter cannons, M134 miniguns, M61 Vulcans, Stinger missiles, Apache attack helicopters, A-10 Warthogs, Abram tanks, the F-15, 16, 22, and 35 fighters, stealth bombers, laser and plasma weapons,
Mr. Melia?
smart bombs, and smart bullets.
Mr. Melia?
Yes, ma'am. I
Would
know.
you
I'm
love
sort
to
of-
hear about weapons in the Judiciary Committee, particularly on a Monday morning?
Yes.
We're short on time. I know there's a
Yes.
lot of folks
Okay.
here. So get you back on track on Senate File 102.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have thoughts on the bill? Do you want it? Are you for or against?
I'm sort of half and half because the other two bills that were struck down were excellent in their completeness. This one here seems to be watered down a bit. I'm not really comfortable with knowing that that 102 would protect us from any federal anything, any agency, et cetera.
So do you want us to
coming
vote
into it.
no?
I would vote no on the point that I don't think it's strong enough. The other two bills I thought were very strong. And I would want, if this could be amended to, it was similar to the other two bills, that it would definitely give comfort to people that the federal government and even the state government couldn't come in and say, because of this or that or something else, we are going to take your guns. And I'm going, it's gone through history and I don't want to see that history repeated. So I will leave it up to you, your best judgment and the comments of the other people. I like the other two bills better than I like this one. So sorry I rambled, but you know.
So yes or no, Mr. Melia, what should we do?
I'll leave that up to you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Melia. Sir, please come forward, front row.
Oh.
Nope, sir, come on.
Cut a deal.
Come on. Yep. Welcome. If
We
you
did
could,
cut a deal.
all right, if you could introduce yourself, state your name and who you're
Hello,
with
my
for
name
the
is
committee.
Greg Hunter. I'm from Laramie, Wyoming. Thank you for having me, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. I just, I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment. I've looked at the history. So when I look at the National Firearms Act, it was kind of created due to prohibition. If we really look at the history of that particular law, I don't understand why we ever started the drug war because, we created the largest crime wave in American history by doing prohibition, and then we exported that worldwide. So my question is that if I'm a Wyoming citizen, can I have a machine gun and can I make a bazooka and the local sheriff will just let me alone? But if the feds
Do
come
you
in,
want to make a bazooka?
well, based on the words of some of the senators in here, I hear that it's intractable and we're going to have a war. So if we're going to have a war, I would really like to know whether I can, maybe if I'm such an Eric Prince or somebody like that would have access to be able to make my own weapons and have those things. Could I do that in Wyoming? And I don't have any fear. I just want to make sure that I have no fear from any of the Wyoming police or sheriffs about my operation. So if they come in, they'll look around, I'm creating bazookas, and it's all good, right? Is that what this bill means?
Mr. Hunter?
I'm just trying to figure it. Yes, yes, Madam Chairwoman.
So we don't answer questions necessarily of the public. We're here to listen to you and you can share with us your thoughts. Are you
Okay.
for or against the bill? It's not clear to me.
Well, it just like before, it feels like it brings in jeopardy. The other bills, it felt like that Wyoming would actually fight the feds if I broke the National Firearms Act.
So Mr.
This
Hunter, I'm
one
gonna
feels
ask
like
again.
I'm being hung out to dry, so I'm against it.
So you'd like us to vote no?
Yes, I would.
All right. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very
Appreciate your
much.
time. All right. Further public comment on the bill? Welcome, Ms. Muir.
Thank you, Chairman Nethercott and committee members. My name is Tara Muir. I'm the Public Policy Director for the Wyoming Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. I work for our network of crisis programs and shelters across the state. Our programs talk to hundreds of victims every day. We understand this bill seeks to protect gun owners and law enforcement. We appreciate that. And with the proposed amendment on line 6 with the word unconstitutional, perhaps it will continue to protect others. But we would be remiss if we didn't remind the committee that the only people hurt when firearms are not confiscated pursuant to 2 specific federal laws are victims of domestic violence. And of course, those contemplating suicide. But we're here to talk about domestic violence. There's 2 federal laws very specifically that state a defendant in a qualifying protection order or another law convicting them of a crime of domestic violence shall not possess a firearm. Clearly, these are federal laws, and they have clearly been ruled constitutional for now. This is important because when no confiscation happens, when someone's convicted or subject to a protection order, felonies are occurring across Wyoming daily. Access to a gun in a domestic violence situation makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will be killed. And we all know domestic violence very much affects women much more than men. They're so much more often the victims. We'd like to change that, but that's the way it is. So for now, those 2 laws are held constitutional. We might suggest to make a very narrow exception that states what those 2 federal laws are. This does not apply to those 2 federal laws, so that law enforcement can be very clear, especially when they're coming up to a hot situation and someone has firearms. They know what they can confiscate or not. Many states and jurisdictions have passed legislation to mirror and reflect those federal laws, and they've created state policies and procedures to confiscate firearms pursuant to these laws. We would love to have an interim study to really walk through how we could do that in Wyoming, because in Wyoming, over 60% of the convicted murderers who killed their intimate partners did it with a firearm. And what's probably more important is that we hear every day in our programs from survivors that they're not shot at, but that gun is held to their head. If they don't do certain things during the day, they'll leave. There's one story where they leave a bullet on the kitchen counter and says, honey, your name is on it if you leave the house today. So confiscating those kinds of firearms is critically important. These aren't sob stories. They're stories of fear and terror, and we would like domestic violence victims in this state protected clearly as well. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Ms. Muir, thank you. Just a couple of questions. I appreciate the rationale for why the federal law exists associated with the ownership of a firearm or possession of a firearm for those subject to a protection order. So getting back to the application as applied to this bill, and this is just a communication to all of those intending to testify as to the bill. The words written in this bill is what we're here to discuss, not gun laws generally in the United States. And so this bill prohibits Wyoming law enforcement officers from taking certain actions. And so as it applies to your testimony, your concern is that Wyoming law enforcement potentially could not confiscate a firearm where a person who was a prohibited federal offender or subject to federal law as a result of being subject to a domestic violence protection order or a domestic violence conviction that this would perhaps interfere with their ability to seize that firearm or arrest that suspect. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So for those wishing to provide additional public comment on this, addressing that particular concern, and I know, Ms. Mayor, you have thought of some proposed amendments I'll share with the committee to continue to think about and make sure that we don't end up with an absurd result as it applies to that concern. Okay, thank you, Ms. Muir. Any
Thank you.
questions for Ms. Muir from the committee? Okay, thank you. Further public comment? Yeah, come on forward. Mr. Odekoven, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Byron Odekoven, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address the committee on Senate File 102. To start, let me say that we have reviewed the bill, and as the sheriffs and chiefs, and on behalf of all 23 sheriffs, I might add, you have letters of support that we've presented to the committee. So with that as the backdrop, let me cover a couple of specific points and talk about some of the background. You've heard my bona fides, if you will, before, but I think it's important for both those in the room and those on Zoom to hear from Wyoming sheriffs and chiefs who may not quite understand where we come from when it comes to the Second Amendment. We're a very pro Second Amendment group. In fact, I think I've shared with the committee before and waived my NRA credentials, of which not only list me as a life member for several decades, but also being a benefactor and patron member as well, which means I've put my money where my mouth is, where the national group is for protecting the Second Amendment rights. Along those lines, and it was, I appreciate that Senator Hicks mentioned and included the first Brady Bill Supreme Court case in the legislation as well. Many don't realize that there were actually two sheriffs that filed amicus briefs associated with that, pushing back on the federal government for what was to be an overreach from the Brady Bill legislation onto law enforcement. There were two sheriffs that participated in that, one being a sheriff in Arizona, the second was a sheriff in Wyoming. I was that sheriff. So yes, my background, my reputation, yes, we would push back on the federal government in terms of an overreach, as the bill describes. The way the bill is crafted, in our opinion,
Mr. Odekoven, just briefly, what year was that approximately?
90, Madam Chair, I believe it was 97 or 98 when that Supreme Court amicus brief was presented. The court actually mentioned our amicus brief in their reference that the Brady Bill did in fact put an undue burden on law enforcement and chiefs and sheriffs at that time.
And you were a Wyoming sheriff back then?
Yes, ma'am, I was. So the way the bill is written, I think it's important to review the construct that it looks to prohibit law enforcement, or anyone else for that matter, from taking any action on any unconstitutional attempts to infringe on the Second Amendment. So that it likewise leaves in place the federal legislation that is constitutional, that we utilize today in our actual activities and our duties as law enforcement. So part of the question that you asked had to do with domestic violence. I believe it's in 18 USC 922G.
Correct.
If I remember correctly, talks about domestic violence orders, and folks having firearms associated with domestic violence. That would not change under this bill. We would continue our business as usual because we took an oath to uphold the Constitution, the laws of the United States, and the laws of the state of Wyoming. That is the Constitution and the laws therein. So therefore, yes, we would continue to enforce those laws given this bill. Likewise to note, in 2010, when we did the Wyoming Firearms Freedom Act, which was referenced, we spoke in favor of that bill to help protect the citizens of Wyoming. In fact, I find it fascinating that last year, I believe it was the state of Oklahoma who passed almost a mere bill to the Wyoming Firearms Freedom Act. And it was touted as one of the best Second Amendment Preservation Act bills in the nation. We were vilified in Wyoming for not passing such a law. Somebody forgot to read our existing statutes. It's been in effect since 2010, and we testified in favor. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to the Second Amendment preservation, the bills that we have before us, and the one that we're speaking about today on what it does or does not do. From our perspective, it protects Wyoming citizens. It upholds the Constitution, preserves the Second Amendment. Thus, we presented support for the bill. Madam Chair, we have our president, Chief Dwayne Pacheco, I believe on Zoom, and would ask that he be allowed to comment on behalf while I'm here as well, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Otokoven. Briefly, Mr. Otokoven, if you know, how long has Wyoming maintained one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the country? Do you know?
Madam Chair, I would be speculating at best, but judging from previous testimony on other gun bills, I would say it's a long time.
1869 about?
I'm thinking if we're talking Wyoming, something about statehood comes to mind.
Or territory days?
Or territory, yes, Madam Chair.
1869.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Mr. Pacheco, welcome. Good to see you this morning. If you could introduce yourself to the committee and share with us your thoughts on the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Dwayne Pacheco. I'm police chief here in Rock Springs and also president of the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police. I'm a retired 20-year United States Air Force reservist and a 31-year peace officer, all with the Rock Springs Police Department. And I would ask the committee to vote yes on the Second Amendment Protection Act, Senate File 102. As our executive director stated, we did have quite a bit of conversation with sheriffs as well as the chiefs, and we're able to provide you with a letter of support as well, which I hope that you all were able to read. And we believe that this is, with amendments from Senator Hicks, a very good legislation for the Second Amendment.
Chief Pacheco, thank you for your service, both in the United States Air Force and in the law enforcement in the state of Wyoming. Appreciate all that you do. How is K Street this morning?
It's quiet. Thank you very much. We've been able to keep that at bay for the last 31 years, I might add.
All right, appreciate that. Any questions from the committee? Chief Pacheco, thank you so much. Mr. Otokoven, thank you for fighting for gun rights in this state for your entire life as a Wyoming citizen. I think Wyomingites aren't given the credit that they're due for having that highest rate of gun ownership and doing it well and doing it without out-of-state interference. So,
Madam Chair, and the only other thing that I would offer in conclusion is sometimes we in Wyoming, in terms of law enforcement, are vilified also for our association with groups that we belong to nationally. And part of what I remind the committee is, and I've said it several times before, is we belong to some of those national groups so that we can attend the meetings and vote no. When they want to come up with an absurd firearm bill, we vote no, because at both of those groups, it's one state, one vote. If you don't attend, that vote isn't registered. So we attend some of those national meetings to, in fact, uphold the Constitution and the Second Amendment by voting no to some of those national desires that they present.
thank you, Mr. Otokoven. All right, further public comment. It's 9:43. You've got counting down now. We will adjourn this meeting at 9:47. Welcome.
And Chairwoman, Senators, my name is Mark Jones. I'm a national director with Gun Owners of America. We're a national gun rights group representing 2 million members and supporters. I also happen to be a Johnson County resident. Every morning I'm blessed to wake up and look at the Bighorn Mountains and pronghorn antelope in my pasture. So I can speak to this bill both as a representative of Gun Owners of America and as a Wyoming citizen. As we all know, the citizens of Wyoming cherish our right to keep and bear arms. Sadly, this right is under attack every day by an overreaching federal government. Gun Owners of America fights in Congress and in the courts in Washington to protect our rights. However, the citizens of Wyoming need additional protections. That is where a Second Amendment Protection Act comes into play. SAPA makes it illegal for state or local officials to enforce unconstitutional gun control using principles found in the 10th Amendment and in U.S. Supreme Court cases that have upheld anti-commandeering doctrine. SAPA is a legal and valid way that a state can stand between an overreaching federal government and law-abiding citizens. So we urge you, senators of this committee, to pass this bill, to move this bill forward with no weakening amendments. I understand and appreciate the comments from the gentlelady who is concerned about domestic violence. But as you just heard from Mr. Odekoven, this bill does not impact an officer's ability to protect people from domestic violence. No one is trying to do that here. So we need no further amendments on this. We certainly do not need to put an amendment on this bill that would appear to be a red flag law. So I urge you not to amend that, not to weaken the bill. So in its current form, we believe this is an effective bill. We support the bill. We encourage you to move it forward. We thank you. I know that I believe all four of you were co-sponsors of this bill. We appreciate that. We hope we can move it to the Senate and move it forward to protect the citizens of Wyoming. I would be happy to answer any questions. I do have a fellow Johnson County citizen that has been waiting on Zoom since 8 o'clock this morning that would like to speak, if that is possible. His name is Mr. Jeff Carmichael. And other than that, thank you for what you're doing here. Please move the bill forward, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you for being here. Mr. Jones, Senator Hicks presented some amendments. Do you support those amendments?
If I understood the amendments, I think they're acceptable. I think he's attempting to clear up some confusion in the bill. I don't think it was an attempt to undermine the strength of the bill. I think it was an attempt to make sure we can prosecute criminals, but protect law-abiding gun owners from an overreaching federal government. You know, no one's intent here is to tie the hands of law enforcement in prosecuting criminals. What we want to do is protect law-abiding gun owners in Wyoming. And we've already talked about how many there are. We want to protect law-abiding gun owners in Wyoming from unconstitutional infringements, like my colleague with the National Shooting Sports Foundation explained, some of the plans that the Biden administration has for pistol braces, for bump stocks and everything else. I could go on all day. We want to protect people's rights, law-abiding people's rights to have firearms.
All right, thank you. Mr. Carmichael is on the phone. Is that correct? Mr. Carmichael, if you can hear me, please acknowledge my voice. Does it appear like he's on?
Yes, I am, Madam Chairwoman.
Great. Mr. Carmichael, if you could introduce yourself to the committee, your first and last name and who you're with, and whether or not you're for or against Senate File 102.
My name is Jeff Carmichael. I live and vote in Johnson County. I am for Senate Bill 102. I have a brief statement that I think I can get through really quickly if you'd allow it.
I would allow it very briefly, Mr. Carmichael, and just for members of the public watching, it's currently 9:48. We gavel in for session at 10 o'clock. You heard that there's some amendments for us to work. So if this committee is going to pass this bill out today, we've got to close public comment here shortly. So I apologize for those not able to speak. So Mr. Carmichael, you're going to be the last public comment we hear from. You've got a minute. Ready, go.
Okay, I'd like to first thank Senator Hicks and all the co-sponsors of the bill. I'd like to say that never before has the Second Amendment been threatened as it is today. There are those who think it should be repealed in its entirety and those who seek to change it incrementally, small slices at a time, until it is meaningless, dead from 1,000 cuts. In my mind, those latter are the biggest threat. The intent of the framers was clear and simple. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, period. As you all clearly understand, the framers wrote the Second Amendment against to guard against tyrannical government run amok. Senate File 102 is written to guard against potential rogue or misguided efforts in the state of Wyoming to assist or abet any attempt by the federal government to infringe in any way, including small cuts, our Second Amendment rights. SB 102 does this in a specific and meaningful way while not including language found in previous bills that garnered opposition from law enforcement. I urge this committee in the strongest way possible to pass Senate Bill 102 onto the House and the floor. Pass the bill without cuts or slices. Do not change it to be more palatable to those who do not truly support the Second Amendment rights of myself, my children, my grandchildren, and posterity, as the framers intended. The people of the country have been slow to wake up. The people of Wyoming have been slow to wake up. I have been slow to wake up, but I'm awake now. The people are awake now, and we are watching. Actions like those recently taken in the House will not go unnoticed, and we, the people, now fully awake, will not forget. Any attempts to weaken this bill by amendments will be recognized for what they are and remembered. SB 102 is a good bill that truly does what is needed to ensure that Wyoming can protect its citizens' Second Amendment rights.
Mr. Carmichael,
Sorry?
thank you so much.
Okay,
You
thank
have-
you, and
you
I
have-
do support the bill with the current amendments. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carmichael. Appreciate your testimony. Thank you for being here today. With that, public comment is closed. Committee, back to you. Moved by Senator Cost, seconded by Senator Kolb. Are there amendments?
Madam Chair,
Senator Cost.
I would like to approve the amendments set forth by Senator Hicks
All right, so
on pages.
on page 3, line 6,
Yes, unconstitutional.
after the word any, to add the word unconstitutional. Is that right?
Yes.
And then on line 7, to delete the words judicial or, is that correct?
Correct.
Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Seconded by Senator Kolb. Further discussion on that motion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion has passed. Ms. Eatman, do you have that amendment?
Not entirely. Could I get a copy from Senator Hicks so I make sure it's correct?
No, but I'll get you a copy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So, and I'll just repeat it again. So on page 3, line 6, after the word any,
Yeah, I have that part.
to write
It's the-
unconstitutional,
Yes,
and then on line 7 to strike judicial or.
yes, I've got those.
And that's the
two.
First Amendment.
Okay,
Do you have that?
yes.
All right. So now we'll go on to the Second Amendment, which I think is still on page 3, line 17, a new sentence after the word section. Senator Cost.
Nothing in this act shall be construed to prohibit Wyoming subdivisions, I believe it is,
We're going to use the word government entities.
government entity for the purpose of enforcing Wyoming state laws. That sound good?
No. So this will read, nothing in this act shall be construed to prohibit Wyoming government entities from accepting federal funds for law enforcement purposes.
I kind of left that out, didn't I? Thank you.
Is there a second to Senator Cost's motion?
Second.
Seconded by Senator Kolb. Further discussion on that motion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion has passed. Ms. Eatman, would you like me to read that one more time?
Yes, please.
All right. So we're going to add the following sentence on page 3, line 17. It's a new sentence. Nothing in this act shall be construed to prohibit Wyoming governmental entities from accepting federal funds for law enforcement purposes. All right, Senator Cost, you have a third amendment?
On line 20, after who, the word inserted knowingly violates subsection A of this section. Is there anything else there that I might have missed? 'Cause I haven't written down.
Misdemeanor below.
That's right.
Let's make that one amendment.
Okay. And then.
Speak into your mic. Is your mic on?
Oh, I'm sorry. So let me do that again. Line 20, after who, insert the word knowingly. And on line 21, after two, I believe he has to strike
To add misdemeanor.
and add misdemeanor penalties, which penalties is already there.
So Senator Cost, your motion is on page 3, line 20, after the word who, to add the word knowingly.
Yes.
And then on line 21, after the word subject,
Yes. I think it
subject to,
should- Yeah,
strike the word the and replace with misdemeanor.
correct.
Ms. Eatman, do you have that motion?
Yes, I do.
All right,
That's a third amendment.
that's
Is
the
that
third
correct?
amendment.
Okay.
We just kind of took one big amendment, and broke it
Okay.
into 3 for ease of getting it correct. So is there a second to Senator Cost's motion?
Second.
Seconded by Kolb. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That motion has passed. Further amendments to the bill or discussion? Question being called, roll call vote.
Senator Cooper,
Aye.
Senator French,
Absent.
Senator Kolb,
Aye.
Senator Cost,
Aye.
Chairman Nethercott.
Aye.
Madam Chair, Senate File 102 passed as amended with 4 ayes and 1 absent.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you, good senators. Thank you, members of the public.
I'll go back to Zoom.
Yeah, that was.